Welcome to our first podcast on federalism. In this podcast, we will be looking at defining federalism and the constitutional basis of federalism. There are two learning objectives with this podcast. The first is define federalism and explain its consequences for American politics and policy. The second learning objective is outline what the Constitution says about division of power between national and state governments and states' obligations to each other, and trace the increasing importance of the national government. As you listen to this podcast, think about these questions. How would politics and policies be different in America if there were a unitary system instead of a federal system, or a confederation instead of a federal system? Did a federal system influence the civil rights movement? Would this change have occurred faster in the South if America had been a unitary democratic system? Can you think of any negative effect such a system might have had on the outcome of the civil rights movement? Let's begin with defining federalism. A system of organizing governments. Federalism is a way of organizing a nation so that two or more levels of government have formal authority over the same area and people. Only 11 out of approximately 190 nations of the world have federal systems. Most governments in the world today have unitary governments in which all power resides in the central government. In a confederation, the national government is weak, and most or all of the power is in the hands of its components. The working of the American system are sometimes called intergovernmental relations, which refers to interactions among national, state, and local governments. The United States has over 451 governments. That includes federal, state, and local governments. This chart shows authority relations in three systems of government: unitary, confederate, and federal. Why is federalism so important? The federal system decentralizes our politics. Federalism decentralizes our policies. National campaigns for the presidency actually take place in the states because candidates must win states rather than the national votes. The constitutional basis of federalism. The word federalism is not mentioned in the Constitution. 18th century Americans had little experience in thinking of themselves as Americans first and state citizens second. The division of power. The writers of the Constitution carefully define the powers of state and national governments. Although favoring a strong national government, states were retained as vital components of government. The Supremacy Clause deals with the question of which government should prevail in disputes between the states and the national government. Article 6 states that 3 items are the supreme law of the land: The Constitution. Laws of the national government, when consistent with the Constitution. Treaties, which can only be made by the national government. Judges in every state were specifically bound by the Constitution. Questions remain concerning boundaries of the national government's power. The national government can only operate within its appropriate sphere and cannot usurp the state's powers. The 10th Amendment states that powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states, respectively, or to the people. There have been variations in the court's interpretation of the 10th Amendment. This chart shows the Constitution's distribution of power. Establishing national supremacy. 4 key events have largely settled the issue of how national and state powers are related. The McCulloch v. Maryland case, the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Commerce Clause, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement. Let's first look at McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819. McCulloch v. Maryland was the case that first brought the issue of state versus national power before the Supreme Court. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that national policies take precedent over state policies. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the government of the United States, though limited in its power, is supreme within its sphere of action. The court also ruled that the Constitution gives Congress certain implied powers that go beyond the enumerated powers that are specifically listed in Article 1, Section 8. The Civil War settled militarily the issue that McCulloch had enunciated constitutionally. The Civil Rights Movement, a century after the Civil War, the policy issue was equality. In 1954, the Supreme Court held that school segregation was unconstitutional. Brown v. the Board of Education. The conflict between states and the national government over equality issues was decided in favor of the national government. Throughout the 60s, the federal government enacted laws and policies to end segregation in schools, housing, public accommodations, voting, and jobs. Alabama Governor George Wallace failed stand in 1963 to resist integration of the all-white University of Alabama. States' obligations to each other. Federalism involves more than the relationship between the national government and state and local governments. Article 4 of the Constitution outlines certain obligations that each state has to every other state. Full faith and credit. States are required to give full faith and credit to the public acts, records, and civil judicial proceedings of every other state. This is what allows you to have a driver's license from South Carolina and be able to drive in another state legally. Extradition. States are required to return a person charged with a crime in another state to that state for trial or imprisonment. Privileges and immunities of citizens. Citizens of each state receive all the privileges and immunities of another state in which they happen to be in. In today's podcast, we defined federalism and we looked at the constitutional basis of federalism. Our next podcast on federalism will deal with intergovernmental relations today and understanding federalism. This concludes our first podcast on federalism. Thank you for joining in.